Welcome to Art's Not History, where we'll be looking at the practices of various different contemporary artists, exploring how and why they make their work. We'll be hearing from the artists themselves directly, so it's not so much art history as art now. Today I'm delighted to be in the New Court Gallery in Repton in Derbyshire in the UK, looking at the work of the sculptor Denis O'Connor. He's made a series of sculptures that explore the Irish coastal landscape in metal. Do you think you could explain how your sculptures interpret the landscape?
The work is in reference to where I live in Ireland, and it's a connection that I have with West Cork. Geographically, it's the most southerly point of Europe and Ireland, and with living there, I've been able to make kind of observations of that space, but the observations are done by kayaking or through kayaking, and I'm looking from the water in to the land. So that's maybe goes back to the question of this kind of relationship. What do they look like the landscape, or what makes them reference the landscape? So normally our views of landscape are kind of almost a picture postcard, and they're done from the land. My views, my references come from the water looking in onto the land. So they're views that I would say 99% of people won't see. For me, it is about the physical activity of being on the water, being able to go through caves, into caves, undercut cliffs, observe blowholes, get a feel of some of the edges, the fragmentation of that landscape. So when you're in the kayak, you're kind of touching the stuff, physically touching it as well. And it just gives me that real sense of when I'm there, that information that is taken back into my own brain through bits of drawing, or I make short videos on the GoPro or little photographs. I can bring that information back to the studio and then start to form the elements, the material of steel, which gives a kind of a feeling of that space, a physical feeling of that space. That first-hand activity is vital for the work. Unlike the Derbyshire landscape where I'm walking it or cycling through it, the experience of the Irish landscape is very, very different. And it's the coastline, it's on the edge of Europe, and it's on the edge of Ireland. And I find its symbolic nature very important, but also the way that land is formed by the sea, by the Atlantic. There's an area called Black Rocks, and that's where the big tunnel is in the film. And to go into something, to go into this, the land, the geography, the space, underground, is quite fascinating.
Does that have another meaning when you start layering those forms together?
Life isn't just A to B, we have to shift, we have to adapt, and life is quite layered in many ways, and when I cut these things, and I'm kind of thinking, is one element enough, or should I put 7 layers together to make it a bit more, I suppose, convincing? And then you have to decide, how do I stop that process? And then you stop it, So there's this kind of partly knowledge because of the material, partly knowledge because of observing the landscape. But then this intuitive thing that happens when you put all that bits of information together, and you have to think, right, I've got to be kind of sort of sensible, take risks, and then make a decision that once it's made, it comes into the wide space, and you think, this is it. You look at how it's been formed over thousands of years, and you get these amazing kind of formations, strata, kind of layering, undercuts, whatever, and it's there for us to take on. And I've tried to capture a bit of that in the work, in the sense that it's not just defined by one thing, it's defined by a number of elements.
Perhaps you could explain a little bit about how you deal with those, with gravity, weight and balance.
As a sculptor, I started to kind of take on making it a bit more dynamic, seeing how it would be structured by elevating it, or maybe making the boulder almost ambiguous state where it's unbalanced, it might fall. And you get that in the way the landscape is fractured. And there's bits of cracks. Every year I go back, every summer where we're out there, you see shifts or changes. And I've tried to kind of capture, I think, that kind of fragility of something that is also quite weighty, that it does break, it does fragment. And I've slowly started to do things like elevate the work, make it a little bit higher, a bit more dominant, so it's overpowering. You're looking up at it, you know. And I've used devices like the ladder as well to take the work up. I mean, the ladder is a bit of an irony. You wouldn't balance something on a ladder. That's a bit of an odd thing to do. But I want you to look up at some of the things and realise there is a precariousness about that landscape. But that to me is about the dynamics of sculpture, about, you know, working with different forms and creating a visual dynamic as well as a physical dynamic. There's one piece here which is just held by a tiny ladder of this scale. And yet the piece goes up nearly 3 meters, and you're thinking, oh, well, is the ladder a decorative thing to get you on the rock? But actually the ladder is about holding that piece up. The show you saw 2 years at Derby, Defining a Line, there is one piece called Alone, and it's a very small ladder. Well, it's in width, it's maybe 50 mil, and it travels up about 3 meters, and there's a little chair at the top, and there is a kind of vulnerability about being perched on top of an edge. And sadly, if you come off that edge, you know, life's kind of over, really. So there is this edgy thing about how we lead our lives a bit, you know, and I look at that back at the fragmentation of these rocks. They're constantly changing. And on the edge of Ireland, it's a beautiful place, but it's also a place that has become very vulnerable because of communities leaving, farming, elements of farming disappearing, and I've lost friends through that, some through immigration and some who couldn't cope with the landscape, and they lost their lives, you know, through suicide, and that there's a real issue in Ireland with that vulnerability, and I kind of I think it's like the loss of a culture, and we see it in our lives today. You know, stuff is changing so rapidly, and sometimes the work tries to capture some element of vulnerability. We used to do family holidays in a place called Ballybunion in North Kerry, and there was a particular rock called the Horseshoe Rock, where it was literally rock that was a shape of a horseshoe that you could swim through. And when I was very young, my mom and my sister and I went out there, and we got trapped by the tide. And I kind of thought of that terrible experience. We could have been almost drowned, really. When you look at the piece now, it's like you look into this hole, and it's unending, it's kind of infinite, there's a danger there. But out of it comes this kind of other form, and the ladder, which almost saves us a bit, or brings us somewhere else. We kind of swam and walked with the water right up to our necks, and got out of the horseshoe rock and brought us to safe ground. So that was my resolvement of the piece. The patination I use, it's almost, you can see around the edges of it, it's starting to fragment. Some of the dust is coming off it, and you just, it's like sand almost, you know. And boulders came from sand, and that evolution of how the landscape was made. The surfaces are treated very differently. So the one here is got a graphite, so it brings it back to that kind of lead-based kind of patination or colouring. I mean, there's one piece particularly where it's got inset stainless elements. So it felt very important that that piece wasn't done in a graphite surface. It felt important that it should be patinaed with the rust, and then the stainless elements, which are bright stainless, would work against it. They would show up more. The piece behind us here on the left, which is called Rock Breakers, I've used stainless, you know, with this kind of rusted patina, you know, so those combinations are important. There must have been a genuine excitement about when sculpture moved from a solid block, a carved block. So you're abstracting elements all the time, mass, volume, whatever. material to create form, to moving towards taking separate elements and joining them together. And that to me was phenomenal, you know. And as you described that kind of process, I'm still part of that tradition. But I do remind myself by going back to places like Berlin, looking at the galvos, you know, and kind of really getting a sense of what they were thinking about at that time. Now, I don't think that puts the work in a category that it's dated, because I just see there's a challenge there for me as an artist to partly be influenced by some of those processes or that thinking behind how work was then made through these fragmented elements, or collaged, constructed, you know.
No, but in a sense, they're almost glued together.
They were glued together,
It's welding, but it's still a kind of part-to-part construction.
And I think it defines what I was saying earlier, the intuitive process I used to make the work. It is like a process of three-dimensional drawing in that sense. And there might be a bit that I don't like, and I draw that, and then I cut that off again. So it gives me a kind of a way of working to construct, but also to abstract, and then to construct again, and then to kind of form and finish. Why would you make a steel boulder? You know, it's kind of goes against the notion of the material of the landscape. The material of the landscape is closer to clay or closer to plaster maybe, or carved stone. But this is my knowledge, this is my training, and I think it's partly that tradition of continuous tradition of sticking things together, but in a way, sticking them in a kind of a sophisticated way that there's a kind of irony there. It's made from fragments, but it's steel. And there's this kind of oddity about, oh, it's steel, so why is it steel? So it kind of gets you to question a little bit. And I think that's part of what you can do conceptually, but you can do as a maker as well.
You've created a series of stone towers at the National Stone Centre. I just wondered if you could talk about how those works have evolved and what prompted you to combine stonework with steel.
There is a heritage of kind of the quarrying of stone in Wirksworth. It came out of lead mining. Then you had the open quarries where stone was quarried for tarmac, roads, building. I just kind of found that the idea of putting the towers into those quarry spaces, redundant quarry spaces, was a kind of an acknowledgement of that kind of past industry, but also to create works that kind of looked ahead, looked at how those quarries might evolve. I'm not a stone person, you know. I had to contract 2 stonewallers to work with me on the towers. And I felt kind of my element would be the steel element. So I was able to bring in an element of a ladder or a house or, you know, some other forms that would kind of enhance the stone, give it another kind of quality. Bring 2 materials together is kind of important in how the work is kind of finalised really or resolved. Just brings another kind of edge to it, another quality to it. For me also the steel has a link back to when the quarries were worked industrially with machinery. So there's they have rusted the steel, so there's a kind of connection there with those big industrial kind of machines that cut and blasted the stone.
I must say it's a very elegant sculpture, and I really like the relationship between the steel, these curving steel ladders at the top, and this kind of elegant, almost cannon-like form beneath. Could you tell us a little bit about how those ideas evolved?
This was the second tower that we made here. There's a reference to the Derwent Valley mills, and they all had kind of a series of tall chimneys, towers, brick towers. Just behind us is the old High Peak Trail, which was the industrial quarry line between Cromford and Buxton. And there's a series of 2 towers there that kind of used to pull the trains up the inclines. So it's kind of reference really to that kind of industrial heritage, or that's now partly gone. So I thought it was appropriate to bring the tower back into the stone centre where stone is quarried. We've made it, you know, as you say, very elegant kind of structure. But then it has these kind of floating ladders at the top, which kind of take it on a type of visual kind of journey somewhere else, you know, whether it's train track, you know, or about some of the industrial equipment.
The way the ladder projects out of the stonework is actually really quite dramatic, and you've got this like lovely overhang as well. What's going on there?
It's about kind of using the steelwork to somehow bring the viewer into the work and think about it in another way. So that angular kind of ladder with the building overhanging is to kind of try and create again a tension within the works. Even on this site alone, there's a number of kind of shafts. So the tower is like the negative of the shaft. But yeah, again, you can see the tower is, only 4 meters high. The shafts, were 30 meters underground, and these were kind of carved out, and lead was extracted. So there's a sense that it's about kind of acknowledging the lead mining, but a kind of positive of that hole, that shaft. But as you look up the tower, then you have the ladder which elevates a particular building. Tower 4 at Burley Sculpture Gardens makes reference to the detail in the architecture of Burley House, particularly the domed element of the tower. And out of that comes other elements that are made in stainless steel. 2 extrusions, they're kind of like journey lines. They're a sculptural device that hold a ladder and a house. So there's a kind of reference back to some smaller scale elements with the larger scale element of the tower. And that goes back to the kind of scale of Burley House. So playing with scale at different levels within the piece of work. I don't think you can just draw it and make it. You have to engage with the fabrication of the steel, and it kind of starts to tell you stuff as well. The way you start to, when I draw it, chalk it up from a sheet, I plasma cut it, I then press it, and then I start to put these maybe 50 press forms together to create a boulder. And somehow there is then a drawing appears of maybe a sense of a shape of a boulder, but sometimes it takes its own shape, and I think it's good to have that knowledge, because I've been making sculpture for 25 years, so I kind of feel I'm okay to do that, Why should I just follow a drawing? It's not a design process. I don't work just to a plan, I mean, I do with the public works because of the audience and the engineering elements. Here I like to make my own rules, but go through the process of making the work in the studio, which is really important. The studio stroke workshop is central to my practice as a sculptor. My kind of thinking as a maker is that this is the space where the work gets made, both the private-based commission work and the public commission work. So there's this kind of mix of different works going on here. It's also that place to kind of, explore the form of the sculpture, develop some drawings, then take the drawings into sculpture, work with the material, work with the machinery I've got. So it combines a lot of different things, but it is a kind of space that is sometimes very private to me when I'm making the more gallery exhibition work. The 3 main elements within my sculpture work are defined by a house, a chair, and a ladder. The house is domestic reference. The chair is again a domestic reference, but it's a detail that could be found in a house. And the ladder really is not necessarily domestic, it's more kind of industrial. I just find it intriguing to kind of juxtapose a small house with a large chair, or vice versa, and maybe bring the ladder to unite the two of them together. But more interestingly, I find the chair as a domestic symbol, it allows the viewer to kind of feel part of the chair. So we use the chair for dinner, socializing, and I tend to work with the chair as a solid object. It replaces the human form really. But the minute the chair is upturned or it's pushed at an angle, something different's happening. The ladder form that I use in my sculpture work is a particular device that I use in different ways. Symbolically, it references the notion of going from ground level to an elevated position. The ladder functions, but also I use it as a sculptural device for bringing an element from the ground up into an open space. And it kind of creates a sort of ambiguity by, I suppose, floating something in the air. But it's not a device that you would normally find in sculptural form. A ladder is a kind of dangerous object. If you go too high and you slip, then something happens. You're not alive. So I kind of quite like the notion of using something that is quite odd as a form. And then it becomes a bit more public where I bring in one or two colleagues to help with the elements of welding or whatever. But it's central, it's a core element of what I do, really. And I think without the space, the work wouldn't happen. You'll see from the space, there's bandsaws, different types of welding equipment, plasma cutting equipment, fly presses, drilling equipment. There's a range of equipment. I use them all. They all have a kind of integral value to the making of the work. And they're part of an extension of the way I think, my brain, and how I use my hands.
At the moment, you're working on a series of smaller, somewhat more fragile pieces that explore this house motif. Could you tell us a little bit about how those have come about and how you're working those ideas through?
The challenge is to kind of make these smaller kind of works, really, and still working on some of those kind of familiar forms of ladder, house. I'm kind of trying to examine them differently, and I suppose gives them a more kind of fragile take. One of the pieces we've looked at, particularly this one just below me here, because it has a reference to the house idea, but it also has a reference to field patterns both in Derbyshire and West Cork. So there's this combination of a landscape element where I've constructed with something like 15 mil or 16 mil bar to create the field patterns that are integrated. So it's a double take, where the house is a container, but it also has a reference to landscape. And it kind of plays on something that is not just purely elevated, but it has a kind of, I'm trying to create a kind of visual tension so that will it stand up, will it topple over, So it's kind of trying to push the parameters or the elements of the material so that there is a sense that there's an uneasiness going on there through that kind of elevation. And I think it's the unexpected as well. I think if it just sits purely on a plinth and it's steady ground, that's something I can't fight against, really. My most recent exhibition at the Shimsa Tira Gallery in Tralee in County Kerry, you will see within that body of work and the way it's been kind of installed that it's a mix of references that are autobiographical, also references about landscape, particularly my kayak activities on the Atlantic, but also kind of references to do with family and home and place. And they're then extended into a sense of kind of where is my home, a belonging, where do I live, issues around immigration, some personal conflicts to do with loss, relationship, but also a real sense of, if you look at the title, Along the Western Shore, it's about the edge of Ireland, on the edge of Europe. And that seems a very important location for me. It's a location I feel kind of happiest in. It feels to be my home in that sense.